When you watch the coverage of the Ukraine war, the maps, the missiles, the casualty counts, the emergency aid packages, the natural assumption is that you are watching a two-sided war. Russia on one side, Ukraine backed by the West on the other. Every morning, you're told who is advancing, who is retreating, and who is losing. That framing is the trap, because there is a third player in this war, a player who has not lost a single soldier, a player who has not fired a single missile, a player who, by every measurable economic and geopolitical metric available, is walking away from this war demonstrably stronger than when it started. That player is China. And here is what makes this genuinely staggering. China did not stumble into this position. China did not accidentally benefit from a war it had no hand in. The documentary record, assembled piece by piece, tells a very different story. 48 hours before Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine on February 24, 2022, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin stood together in Beijing and signed what they called a no-limits partnership. No limits. Not a rhetorical flourish. Those are the two operative words in the actual joint statement. Two heads of state. 20 days before the largest land war in Europe since 1945. Most people who saw that meeting treated it as a diplomatic formality. What the record shows is that it was an opening move in a strategy that China has been executing every single day of this war since. By the end of this analysis, you will understand China's position in the Ukraine conflict better than 95% of the commentary available on the subject. Move 1. Energy arbitrage. China positioned itself as Russia's primary economic escape valve, buying oil, buying gas, buying everything the West refused to touch at a price that China alone dictated. Move 2. Industrial lifeline. Industrial. While Western sanctions tried to strangle the Russian war machine, China quietly became the dominant supplier of the technology Russia needed to keep fighting. Move 3. The endgame play. China is not interested in who wins this war. China is interested in who controls the post-war world order, and it has been positioning for that outcome since before the first shot was fired. The anchor number, and this one requires your full attention, is $240 billion. That is the total China-Russia trade volume in 2023 alone, according to Chinese Customs Administration data released in January 2024. That is a record. That is 26% higher than the year before the war started, and it arrived while the rest of the world was applying maximum economic pressure. To understand what China is doing, you have to understand what China believes. There is a strategic doctrine developed by two PLA colonels, Zhao Liang and Wang Xiangsui, and published in 1999 under the title Unrestricted Warfare, whose central argument is this: modern great power competition is not won on the battlefield. It is won in the economic corridors, the technology supply chains, the diplomatic rooms, in every domain except direct military confrontation. The battlefield, these colonels argued, is the domain of the exhausted. The patient actor wins by staying out of it. That doctrine has a companion principle, one Xi Jinping has returned to repeatedly since 2013, which is strategic patience. The belief that the greatest power advantage a rising nation can hold is time, the discipline to wait while rivals exhaust themselves and then step into the vacuum they leave behind. Hold those two frameworks together, unrestricted warfare plus strategic patience. Now look at what China has actually done since February 2022. Russia, under Western sanctions, faced a catastrophic shortage of semiconductors, microelectronics, and dual-use components, the parts that function equally well in consumer electronics and weapons guidance systems. The Kiev School of Economics, in its February 2024 report, found that China accounted for 90% of Russia's microelectronics imports by end of 2023. 90%. A near-total supply monopoly on the components keeping Russian weapons production operational. The historical precedent here is uncomfortable but precise. During the American Civil War, Britain officially declared neutrality, but British-built ships ran blockades for the Confederacy. British textile mills quietly benefited from the disruption to American cotton exports. Britain did not choose a side. Britain chose the outcome that served British structural interests and extracted maximum value while both sides bled. China has read that chapter of history with great care. Wang Yi, China's foreign minister, stated the official position in March 2023. China has always stood on the side of peace and will continue to push for a political solution. That is not the language of a mediator. That is the language of a party that understands it benefits from the war's continuation and needs diplomatic cover to maintain the position comfortably. Now follow the energy trail, because this is where strategic patience becomes arithmetically measurable. Before February 2022, Russia supplied approximately 40% of Europe's natural gas. When the invasion began, Europe scrambled to cut that dependence, spending hundreds of billions of euros on liquefied natural gas imports, emergency energy infrastructure, and alternative sourcing agreements. That transition was extraordinarily expensive and is still unfinished. China moved in the opposite direction. Russian crude oil exports to China, per the International Energy Agency's October 2023 report, doubled in the 2 years following the invasion. Russia, cut off from Western markets, had nowhere else to send the supply, so it sold at a discount. China bought at a discount. Bloomberg Economics estimated in Q3 2023 that the price differential, the spread between what China paid and what the market rate would have been, ran between $9 and $14 per barrel on 2 million barrels per day, every day, for 2 years. The arithmetic, quietly, runs into the hundreds of billions of dollars in transferred wealth. But here is what those energy numbers and trade figures do not show. The specific infrastructure contracts that China is locking in right now, in corridors that most analysts have not connected, contracts that will determine who controls the movement of goods across this entire century's most critical trade routes. The war in Ukraine has accomplished something that no Chinese military planner could have achieved by force. Something that 50 years of Chinese diplomacy could not have produced at any negotiating table. It has structurally repositioned Russia from a peer rival to China to a junior partner. Think about what Russia was in 2021. The largest country on Earth by territory, a permanent UN Security Council member with independent nuclear deterrence, independent energy infrastructure, independent foreign policy, a nation that played China, the West, the Middle East, all simultaneously without fully committing to any of them. A nation with genuine strategic autonomy. That Russia no longer exists. The Russia that emerges from this war, regardless of whether it claims tactical success in Ukraine, is a Russia that has burned through its foreign currency reserves, sacrificed a generation of working-age men, watched its technology sector hollowed out by the largest brain drain in its post-Soviet history, and become structurally dependent on a single trading relationship for its economic survival. That relationship is with Beijing. Russia's trade with the European Union, which represented 35% of its total trade in 2021, according to Eurostat data, has been replaced almost entirely by Chinese imports and exports. What was a diversified trading portfolio has become a single supplier dependency. And in geopolitics, as in business, when you have only one buyer, that buyer sets the price on everything. Sergei Karaganov, one of Russia's most widely cited foreign policy strategists and a former advisor to the Kremlin, wrote in a July 2023 essay what many in Moscow privately acknowledge, that Russia is moving toward what he called a junior partnership with China. A senior Russian intellectual published using exactly those words. Now this is where the picture changes completely. Consider what this structural dependency means for the physical geography of Eurasian trade. Before 2022, the dominant logistics corridor connecting Chinese manufacturing to European consumers ran primarily through Russia, the Trans-Siberian Rail Network, a route that had functioned for over a century. Sanctions complicated that corridor, and China, rather than waiting for the problem to resolve, has been simultaneously developing alternative routes. The middle corridor through Central Asia and the Caucasus, the expanding Belt and Road infrastructure through Pakistan, Iran, and Turkey. What the Ukraine war did, in practical terms, was accelerate the development of Chinese-controlled trade infrastructure that bypasses both Russia and the Western-dominated financial system entirely. China is building the roads, China is building the ports, China is building the settlement systems, and the disruption created by the war gave that infrastructure construction precisely the justification and urgency it needed to move fast. Here is the counterintuitive statistic that repositions the entire frame. While the United States and Europe collectively committed, by the Congressional Research Service count in March 2024, $380 billion in total support to Ukraine, China's announced military budget over that same 2-year period increased by $42 billion. Not decreased, not stayed flat, increased, while the West channeled its industrial surplus into Eastern Europe. Those two expenditure decisions point in opposite directions. The West is spending its strategic reserves on a European land war. China is spending its strategic surplus on Chinese military capacity, Chinese infrastructure, and Chinese trade positioning. NATO's own published figures from February 2024 show combined European defense spending increased by $380 billion since 2022. That money is being specialized for a Russian threat. Almost none of it is reconfiguring to face the structural challenge that China represents. Europe is rebuilding its eastern flank for a 20th century threat while the 21st century competition advances on a completely different terrain. Here is the part that keeps strategic analysts awake at night, because everything I have just described, the energy flows, the junior partnership, the trade infrastructure, the military spending gap, all of it is oriented toward one specific geopolitical pressure point and one specific window of time, the Taiwan calculation. There is a specific analysis that every serious China security researcher has been working through since February 2022. The logic is uncomfortable but documentable. Xi Jinping has stated publicly, repeatedly, in speeches that are on the official record, that reunification with Taiwan is a matter of historical inevitability, and that this generation of Chinese leadership must not pass that question to the next. The operational question is not whether. The operational question is when. And the Ukraine war has directly shaped that timing calculation in ways that are worth stating plainly. First factor, U.S. military stockpile depletion. The Center for Strategic and International Studies published an assessment in December 2023 finding that U.S. transfers of Stinger missiles, Javelin systems, and 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine had drawn American reserve stocks to levels that would require 2 to 4 years to replenish at current domestic production rates. 2 to 4 years. That is not classified information. That is a publicly available assessment from a credible Washington institution, stating plainly that a second major simultaneous conflict during that window would stretch American logistics to a point of genuine operational risk. A conflict in the Taiwan Strait would be a second major simultaneous conflict. Second factor, alliance exhaustion. Every month of the Ukraine war has tested the cohesion of the Western alliance. The debates over ammunition packages, over financing thresholds, over escalation management, over the role of American domestic politics, all of it is being observed in Beijing with granular attention. What Beijing sees is that sustaining Western support for even one conflict, a conflict in Europe against a clear aggressor, with a democratic victim, with unambiguous UN Charter violations, is politically exhausting for every democracy involved. Project that exhaustion onto a conflict in the Pacific. 10 times the distance. 10 times the economic interdependence. 10 times the logistical complexity. A conflict over Taiwan would require American forces to operate at the end of a 7,000-mile supply line across the Pacific Ocean, against a military that has been training specifically for exactly that scenario for 2 decades. The RAND Corporation's 2023 Taiwan Conflict Probability Assessment put the risk of serious military miscalculation in the Taiwan Strait between 2025 and 2030 at 45 to 55%. And that estimate, per RAND's own update, has been rising, not falling. With each month, this European war continues to drain Western strategic resources. Before I continue, something deserves a full stop. The United Nations, as of March 2024, has confirmed over 10,000 Ukrainian civilian deaths since the invasion began. Independent monitoring organizations, whose access is more granular than official UN channels, put that confirmed number significantly higher. More than 6 million Ukrainians are currently registered as refugees across Europe, displaced from homes, cities, and lives that existed 3 years ago. Those are not data points in a strategic model. Those are people with families, routines, futures that were interrupted by calculations made in capitals and military academies far from their neighborhoods. Every framework in this analysis, every game theory argument, every strategic probability sits directly on top of that human reality. It belongs in the picture. It belongs in every analysis that tries to be honest about what this war actually is. The historical parallel that applies here is not comfortable. In the years between 1937 and 1941, Japan watched the European powers consume each other in a war that monopolized their military attention, their industrial production, and their strategic positioning across Asia. Britain's focus on Hitler left Southeast Asia exposed. Japan did not manufacture that exposure. It assessed it, waited, and moved through it. The strategic decision and the catastrophe it produced remain among the clearest documented examples in modern history of how great power distraction creates great power opportunity for a patient third actor. Several senior Chinese military officials and state-affiliated researchers have cited these precise parallels in published work over the past 2 years. They are not hiding the framework. They are publishing it. Step back from all of these specific mechanisms for a moment. Because what the energy data, the military stockpile numbers, the Taiwan probability window, the trade corridor maps, what all of it assembled together actually reveals is something about the nature of power itself that most analysts will not say plainly. The most decisive wars of the coming century may not be fought with weapons. They may be won in the time it takes everyone else to notice they've already started. What I want you to take from this is not fear. Fear is not useful. Panic is not useful. What is useful is the map. Because when you understand the structural logic of what China is executing, not the conspiracy narrative, not the villain story, the actual documented strategic logic, you can see the pattern clearly before the headlines announce it. And that is the most genuinely useful thing available in a world that is reconfiguring this fast. Now, I want to give the counter-argument a full, fair hearing. Because serious analysts with serious institutional credentials look at everything I have just described and reach a considerably calmer conclusion. And they are not wrong to do so. Their argument runs as follows. China's apparent support for Russia is not a costless strategy. It is an accumulating liability, a Russia that becomes too dependent on China, that loses too much international prestige from this war, that faces internal political instability as the costs mount, that Russia becomes a drain, not an asset. More critically, China's economic relationship with Europe and the United States still dwarfs its relationship with Russia by every measurable figure. Total China-EU trade in 2023 was $780 billion according to Eurostat, more than 3 times the $240 billion with Russia. Total China-US trade, even with tariffs, ran over $600 billion in the same year. Any move on Taiwan that triggers full Western economic decoupling would inflict consequences on China's export-dependent economy that no Russian energy discount can offset. That argument is serious, and it is not wrong. China is not operating in a risk-free environment, and the assumption that China will move militarily on Taiwan within a specific window is precisely that, an analytical assumption, not a certainty. The honest picture, stripped of both the alarm and the complacency, is this. China has used the Ukraine war to accumulate strategic options it did not have in 2021. Options in energy pricing, options in Russia's dependency, options in trade infrastructure, options in the timing calculus around Taiwan. Whether China exercises any of those options, when, how, under what exact conditions, depends on calculations that are still in motion. What is not in motion is the direction. Here are 3 specific things worth watching, because they will tell you where this resolves before any major headline announces it. Watch the yuan trade settlement percentage. The share of China-Russia trade settled in yuan rather than dollars crossed 90% by 2023, per the Russian central bank's own data. If yuan settlement reaches 40 to 50% of China's total bilateral trade globally within 3 years, the structural shift away from dollar-based trade architecture is no longer a theoretical risk. It is an operating reality. Watch the BRI signing pace. The number of new Belt and Road infrastructure agreements signed in the next 12 months will tell you whether China is consolidating its post-war Eurasian position or retreating under Western pressure. Acceleration means confidence. Deceleration means recalculation. Watch the Taiwan Strait transit responses. The United States Navy and allied partners conduct regular freedom of navigation transits through the strait. When China's official responses to those transits escalate in language, in proximity, or in the scale of accompanying military exercises, you are watching the pressure dial move in real time. That dial is the most reliable leading indicator available. Most people will never connect those 3 indicators into a single coherent picture. But they are the same picture. They are all components of the same structural shift that China has been executing, quietly, methodically, with documented precision, while the world's attention was directed at Ukraine. The most decisive wars of the coming century may not be fought with weapons. They may be won in the time it takes everyone else to notice they've already started.